also he was the founder head of the Competition Commission of India for about 5 years, till he resigned the position in July 2008. During his long, distinguished career, he held many very important and significant appointments in the fields of corporate affairs, industry and commerce. This includes a direct experience of running a business as CEO of 2 PSUs and experience as chairman, member of board of directors of insurance companies, banks, development banks, financial institutions and joint sector undertakings. He also has economic regulatory experience and international experience. As Secretary Ministry of Corporate Affairs, Mr. Dhal was responsible for the enactment of Competition Act 2002. He also introduced several measures to enhance the levels of corporate, setting up the Serious Fraud Investigation Office, strengthening the institution of independent directors, and so on. Mr. Dhal has also been the chairman of a number of committees, including a high-level government committee appointed by the Prime Minister on public procurement. I think that is where his specialty and that is where our interest would come in greater focus. He is consented to chair this session, and now I'll hand over the platform to him. Mr. Dhal, all yours.
Thank you, General Sharma. Thank you, Observer Research Foundation, for this invitation. I'm also relieved that I've been invited to chair the session and not to speak as an expert. Because as you would have noticed, this panel consists of very distinguished experts in the field of defense procurement. Whereas I am from a generalist background, and by accident I headed this committee on public procurement set up by government. As you notice, this session relates to the evaluation of the defense procurement procedure. The session would be until 1 p.m. and the way we have structured is that I would initially give a kind of overall view of the procurement systems and the need for changes in the procurement systems in India. And then there would be 4 expert panelists speaking: Mr. Ravinder Pal Singh, Mr. Jayant Patil, Dr. Vivek Lal, and Mr. Amit Koshish. And we would try to leave about half an hour to 40 minutes for floor discussions. To begin with, as you all know, that public procurement in India is quite a giant affair. It includes procurement of works, procurement of goods, procurement of services, and it is spread across all levels of government and all branches of government. So it is a function which is performed in every ministry, in every department, in every governmental organization. And vertically it goes down from the top, large procurements, way down to the field level. It is related to day-to-day functions of government or the services that government has to provide. The procurement function has also evolved over time. In the years gone by, it was all very simple. Certain goods used to be procured, simple works like buildings, etc. used to be procured. But over the years, it has grown not only in volume and variety, but also in complexity. What we noticed was, in this committee which was appointed by government, which General Sharma referred to, that while procurement is so large in volume and in complexity, amounting to virtually 11 lakh crores per year, out of which about 3 lakh crores is directly by government and its organizations, and about 8 lakh crores by the public sector undertakings. There are varying estimates ranging from 20% of GDP to 30% of GDP. Competition Commission recently had made an assessment that it amounts to virtually 30% of the GDP, but unfortunately no statistical reliable records are compiled and kept on the volume of public procurement. Now, as we all know, that public procurement has a rather dim image in the public perception. People look at it as the soft underbelly of this giant octopus called the Government of India and the state governments. People look at it as being inefficient and costly. Whatever government procures is of poor quality, but the prices are always amongst the highest, and that it is very opaque and that it is ridden with corruption. The reality may not actually be that bad, but that is a kind of public perception heightened by recent instances like the Commonwealth Games and like the 2G and so on and so forth. Now, we notice that the regulatory and the institutional framework for a task which is performed across all branches of government and at all levels of government, the regulatory and institutional framework is in several respects incomplete and weak. The OECD has a matrix for assessing the public procurement function in various countries. And we went by that matrix and we found that the Indian system is deficient in many of the parameters provided in that matrix. And therefore, the objectives of public procurement, that is efficiency and economy, that is transparency, accountability, competition and professionalism, are not truly served by the system as it exists in India. First of all, we found that within the government machinery, there was a lack of leadership for public procurement. Who really is responsible for the overall public procurement and is able to give real-time guidance and real-time reforms in the procurement system? The Ministry of Finance, the Department of Expenditure is the responsible department. But it is laden with so many other responsibilities, mostly of greater urgency and management, that the procurement function gets relegated to the background and is more reactive than proactive. So whenever a ministry, for example, when I was Ministry of Corporate Affairs, this whole project of MCA 21, that is e-governance, the entire interface with the public is now through the portal that we have in the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. I really didn't know how to go about it. I went about talking to Secretary Expenditure, then I went about talking to somebody else who had done an e-governance project, and I sent my Joint Secretary to Andhra Pradesh, and I went and met the Chief Vigilance Commissioner, etc., etc. But I found that real guidance was sort of missing. Each one of us had to do a kind of hit and run or experimenting with what we thought was the best possible way to go about it. So the real leadership in evolving the system as the volume and the complexity of public procurement has grown over the years, that is somewhat lacking in the current situation. So we said that first of all you need somebody to lead this whole function in the government apparatus, and that should be a separate dedicated department within Ministry of Finance. It is there in the US, it is there in UK, it is there in so many other countries. So we also need this kind of real-time leadership. The second thing we found is that there is a weak legal framework for the procurement function, which is of this size and this complexity. That is to say, you have within the central government, and the same thing is replicated at the state government level, you have this GFRs, the General Financial Rules, which are two big volumes, and there are two small chapters there in the GFR which deal with procurement. So in the GFR, the whole purpose is something to compile the financial rules of government, and within that there are two chapters, one relating to works and one relating to goods. So, and these have been updated quite well in 2005, 2006, but yet they are more like updating rather than like reforming. So we said that you need a proper procurement law, as there is in most of the countries, whether it is the US or Europe or anywhere, whether you go to Afghanistan, whether you go to China, whether you go to Nepal, they all have got a public procurement law, which sets out properly the rights and liabilities of the procuring agencies, the accountability of the procuring agencies, and the rights and the liabilities of the vendors. So it is a two-dimensional law and not a unidimensional statute. So that is what we said, that you now need a proper procurement law which will mandate these essential qualities of public procurement, that is transparency instead of opaqueness, accountability, efficiency and economy, competition, and you need to professionalize the whole function. What we observed was that as a general administrator, I have to do many things, so I have to do procurement as well. But do I have the necessary training in procurement? Does my joint secretary, does the officer there, is he aware of the latest developments in procurement, new complex procurements like e-governance? Is he aware of it, and can he handle it? Proper training is required. Our next was that in order to enhance both transparency as well as efficiency and enhance competition levels, and also you need an overarching portal for procurement in the central government. And it should be mandatory that all procurements above a certain level should be put there on the portal. People should be able to access it and see which department is procuring bicycles and which Commonwealth Games is procuring umbrellas at 7,000 rupees an umbrella, and so on and so forth. So every procurement above a certain size should be on the portal. The results of that procurement exercise should be on the portal. The bids which were procured, which were obtained, should be on the portal. Who won and why he won should be there. And there should be a proper grievance procedure. So that was another one of our recommendations. We also said that government has a policy on most areas of its functioning. You have an environment policy, and you have a forex policy, and you have an industrial policy, and so on. So you also need to enunciate properly a public procurement policy. What are the principles which will guide that policy? What are the institutional mechanisms for carrying out that policy? And what are the objectives of public procurement? All these should be enunciated in a separate policy statement. So these were some of the, not going into details because of time constraints, so these were some of our major recommendations. And I did have a talk with some senior officers in government, including Department of Expenditure, that where is this committee going? It is a bit satisfying that action is ongoing on most of these recommendations. As far as the law is concerned, a public procurement bill has now been prepared. I believe it has been approved by the cabinet, and it will be going into Parliament, maybe in the current session itself. The law essentially, I noticed that in its essentials, it captures most of the recommendations that we have made. It mandates, I'll come to the law in a while. Secondly, government is also is moving gradually in the direction of strengthening, evolving and strengthening and maintaining a public procurement portal. And there is a link on where the portal is available. They have also issued directions that e-procurement, progressively we should move towards e-procurement, and from a certain date e-procurement will become mandatory above certain thresholds. They considered our recommendation that there should be a devoted department for procurement, but they have not set up a department, but within expenditure they now have a dedicated division which will carry out the purposes of leadership in public procurement, which we recommended. And they've also set up a grievance and appeals process, which has also been included in the procurement bill. So these are silent reforms which seem to be taking place now in the public procurement domain at the central government. The principles of, first of all, the law will extend the law and observance of the law and procurement in accordance with the principles and processes laid down in the law will extend to the entire gamut of the central government. That is to say, the ministries, all the subordinate offices, all public sector undertakings, any company in which 50% or more is held by the government, etc., etc. There would be exemptions for small procurements below 5 lakhs or such figure as the central government may announce, as well as for emergency or disaster related procurements, as well as for national security and strategic procurements, which is understandable. It incorporates and makes it obligatory for the procuring entity to ensure, and it is responsible and it is accountable to ensure that the procurement process abides by the principles of efficiency and economy, by the principle of transparency, by the principle of fair and equitable treatment to all vendors, that it should observe the principle of competition, and that there should be processes which should prevent or minimize avenues for corruption. The law also enables the central government to give directions relating to offset policy. That is to say, to encourage domestic production within the country, whether it is in the field of defense or in any other area. The law mandates that all procurements above a certain level must be put up on the portal. It lays out a grievance procedure, which is broadly speaking that the first step in a grievance is to address it to an authority within the ministry or department or organization which did the procurement, but at a level higher than the procurement authority. And if there is no satisfaction at that level, then it can go to a redressal committee headed by a High Court judge. There are penalties on both sides. Penalties on the procurement side, if any of these principles is violated, not only corruption, but any of these other principles is violated, there is a penalty for procurement authorities. And there are penalties also on the side of the vendors. If you indulge in lobbying, if you interfere with the process, if you make false representations, if you do bid rigging or collusive bidding, which as you know is practically endemic in supplies to government, cartelization is is prevalent almost by definition. Now there is a competition law which punishes cartelization, but we said that in supplies to government, it should be made a criminal offense, as it is in most other countries. And there is a penalty for vexatious complaints. As you know, it is very easy to put a complaint into government and get the entire process stalled. So now that you have a structured route for grievances, grievance redressal, vexatious complaints should be discouraged and should be punished. A code of integrity is also mandated in the law for the suppliers. The procurement process must mandatorily be fair and equitable, so that you cannot give description of a particular good or a product which may favor one particular vendor through a brand name or through a certain technology. So you have to give the definition of the good or the service that you require by defining its characteristics by way of output rather than by way of brand name. So these are some of the, I don't say that I have gone through the bill comprehensively, but these are some of the features in the bill, and they sort of herald a new regime as far as the institutional framework of procurement is concerned. Now, as you know, the devil always lies either in detail or in the actual implementation. So that is the next step to be seen. So with this broad introduction, we will come now to the individual presentations by our distinguished panelists. May I first call upon Mr. Ravinder Pal Singh to give his presentation. He has been senior fellow. He is an internationally recognized expert in this field and has an awesome international exposure to the procurement function. He has been senior fellow at the Center for Pacific and Asia Studies in Stockholm, UNDP mission leader in Yugoslavia, senior fellow at Geneva Center for Democratic Control of Armed Forces. He has been project leader arms procurement at the Stockholm International Peace Research and senior fellow at our own Institute for Defense Studies. May I request Mr. Ravinder Pal Singh to give his presentation.
I'd like to thank Observer Research Foundation for this opportunity to share my experiences, report my findings on this vexatious question of decision making in public policy. Arms procurement was taken as a sample of how national security decision making processes function in transition democracies worldwide. And the sample looked at 12 countries to begin with, which we got published, and subsequently I went on to work on behalf of NATO Parliamentary Assembly when the transition was taking place from the former war-swept countries, and they wanted to bring their structures, processes, methods in the framework of democratic accountability. Having said that, what I was very happy to find that there was going to be a kind of a interactive workshop, but maybe at some other point in time. So what I have produced is a framework which you could look at, focus on, think, throw, whatever you want to, so that our discussion lead on to something much more practical, which can be applied in the context of our decision-making processes. I'm also glad to report to my esteemed panel that I've been in this business for more than 19 years, and when I first started looking at this question, and India was one of the countries where we studied, there was so much of resistance. Some of my former colleagues are around here and they know that, they witnessed that. Because this question was a no-go question of how governments make decisions. We started the project, India was one of those countries, and there was a participation of former experts. Thereafter, at the Arun Singh committee, the presentation was made on what could we do. The things have moved, certainly there are changes, but regrettably, I don't think we are moving quick enough as compared to some other democracies. I could explain to that in the question and answer session. But coming very specifically to the point at our discussion, I think there's always this challenge, and I think the organizers of this workshop have tried to wrestle with this challenge somehow or the other, whether to focus on micro or macro. macro social factors, macro organizational factors, or to look at the nitty-gritties of the decision making, the legal elements. And I'll draw from my previous speaker's comment. And he's described those principles, and those are valid principles in democracy. And if I may just add to that before I go on, one of the important principles, in Latin I don't want to use the term, is who judges the judges. That's the Latin term of nox ossa olea. Who judges them? For example, who decides what decisions are made, and who verifies them, who validates them, who scrutinizes the decisions, who carries out a review of the entire macro processes. Are these processes publicly accountable? Now, when the question was put out that we're going to have a seminar on non-procurement decision making and streamlining the processes, and my question to Jan Sharma was, streamlining with what objective? For costs, streamlining for technology, streamlining for accountability, because each one of these questions will bring out different elements of inquiry. And I think there is enough presence in this house here to engage this in a rigorous way. And this is where I found the rigorous engagement in our country to look at these questions have not really taken place. And I'm glad that ORF and I think IDSA and Mr. Mishra sometimes back had tried to move the envelope a little forward. So what I've done is basically identified the broader context. And I take three dimensions of the broader context. One is the strategic engagement. Should we look at this question of arms procurement from a threat-dependent perspective or a threat-independent perspective? And there I find that there are certain elements which are missing in our country, and I just want to bring it to your notice so that you could examine that and chew on it. Now, in our context, there has been a tradition of looking at our neighbor to the west, Pakistan, and trying to sort of look at our procurement decision making as a response structure. I raised this point in the Housing Committee as well, and they said, yes, if we get them in order, we are okay. But the question largely is that India is engaged in another kind of a contest, another kind of a competition. And that competition is with our northern neighbor, and the competition, that neighbor is engaged with Japan, with South Korea, with Taiwan Straits, and the United States. So there is another stream of technological contest which is also going on. And unless in our thinking we factor the broader long-term capacity building for this long-term contest which is going to go on for next foreseeable future of 50 years or so, we will always find ourselves that we are running short of what we should be heading on. My second broad outline or the context is to look at governance systems, both in the executive branches and the legislative branches. Executive is an important function of carrying out oversight, scrutiny, or whatever the recommendations of the agency who's going to carry out these functions. The role of the legislative oversight, unfortunately in our country, has not really developed. It has to look at the macro issues, it has to look at the systemic issues, it has to have capacities to look at processes rather than whether we count the tanks and ammunition and this, that, and the other. You know my reference to context. I think that broader engagement of the legislative oversight hasn't developed in our country, and there are reasons for that, which I'll develop later on. The third context which I'm talking about is, and has been mentioned by the previous two speakers as well in the morning, is capacity building. Capacity for what? Certainly capacities to carry out financial risk analysis, capacities to carry out scrutiny of cost assessments, and so on and so forth. But largely, what is still absent in our country, when I compare it, let's say, with countries like South Korea, Japan, South Africa, or Israel, is systemic capacities in the agencies that is going to execute. Now, we all realize that armed forces, which is responsible for the external defense of the country, is engaged in a technical, technological, and an engineering engagement. It's a dynamic process. The target changes and keeps on changing. The threats, considerations keep on changing. So there is a sense of dynamism. But the people who make the first level of decisions, first level of assessments, and this morning Mr. Chopra, and I've been hearing this for almost 20 years from Mr. Santana, way back in 1990s, have a difficulty in carrying out an understanding of what are the engineering requirements. So there, I think it's not only the service or the services, but the executive oversight has to look at what kind of capacities they have to scrutinize, to validate, to verify, and review the recommendations. At the same time, there has to be independent capacities, both in audit structures as well as in the technology oversight adjudication processes. And some of these processes are not developed in our countries. So taking these broad contexts, what I've done is you look at the macro context of how the national security policy making is carried out. Question is, do we have a policy making document which can be reviewed, which has consistency, which has coherence, which is comprehensive, and from there will flow the defense policy making, and from there will flow the defense industrial policy, and from there will flow the defense technology policy, and from there we will be able to integrate defense technology with the advanced key technology which you may like to acquire either through offset routes or different routes. And that is the kind of a capacity building which has to be looked at. Many of these basic documentations have not been developed in our country. Not that it's difficult. I think people sitting in this hall, give them a week or a month, they'll be able to do it. The second dependent variable, I would say, which I'm looking at the cluster, is financial. Budget making, long-term financial forecasting, financial risk analysis, and these are evolving sciences. And the disciplines are being developed. And these will be needed not only in the procurement of the defense sector, these will be needed in the procurement of all kinds of advanced technology sectors, whether you take telecommunications, aviations, shipping, whatever. Now, quite often we say that, 3 minutes, okay, I'll run over it. So these points are there for you to look at, and maybe in the question answer session, we can look at it in a more careful way. The third cluster we need to look at is military industrial complex, as we try to call it. Now those models were developed, whether it is DRDO, was developed in 1950s from Defense Science Organization design in 1949. The country has evolved. The capacities have developed, but the models are still old. We have a very interesting case, which I have a very hard time explaining to my colleagues. We have a research and development organization, which is triple-hatted. The person who is going to develop the weapon system in the research and development line agency is also carrying out oversight as a defense secretary. He is also the scientific advisor to inform the elected representative what are the scientific alternatives. So unless we have this kind of a decentralization of power, decentralization of capacities which carry out checks and balances and verification, we will have convergence of interest, basically, and that is not very good for competitiveness. I'll quickly go over. I think in our country we need to develop independent capacities for technology verification, validation, scrutiny and review. And that has to be based on on engineering skills. And thereafter, advanced quantitative analysis skills you are familiar with, whether it's operational research, decision analysis, or systems analysis, or systems engineering. So that kind of a mix is absent in our executive oversight. That kind of capacity is not accessible for a legislative oversight. And that kind of capacity is